And we're going live. We are live. Okay, great. Yay.
Good
Figured
morning.
it out.
Good morning.
Good morning, everyone. It's bright and early for some of us here on Pacific time and a little bit early for some of you on East Coast time, but thank you so much for joining us. This is our last chat. We've done 4 of these now, or this is our 4th one that we did this May. And we have just been really happy to be able to come on and talk about some issues that we feel like are important to us. We talked about abortion, adoptive parents, reunion, and today we're talking about just this sort of conversation around being pro or anti-adoption. So we're very excited. It looks like we have a couple people watching. If you're any adoptees, we'd love to have you join us in the comments. If you have any questions or comments to add, that would be awesome. And we'll be sure to get to those throughout. So real quick, we're just going to go around and do some introductions. My name is Rachel. I'm one of the co-creators of Rewriting Adoption, and I am a transracial adoptee as well as a international adoptee from Peru. And I'll pass it off to my sister, Sarah.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm Sarah. I am also the other co-creator of Rewriting Adoption. And it's basically copy and paste the same TRA, International Peruvian Adoptee. I'm really excited to be here. And I'll throw it to you, DJ. You're right below my square.
Hi, everyone. I'm DJ. I am pronouns she, her. I am a transracial domestic infant adoptee with Peruvian ancestry, and I'm excited to get to know all of you better. I'm gonna kick it over to Kristen.
Hello, excuse me. I'm Kristen. My pronouns are she and her. I'm a private domestic infant adoptee and happy to be here. I'll throw it over to Martha.
Hi, I'm Martha, and I am a closed domestic adoptee from foster care, and my birth parents were immigrants from Mexico, but I was born in the US, but I am also a transracial adoptee as well, and I'll throw it to Isaiah.
Hi, good morning. I am a transracial domestic adoptee, and my adoption was closed. I was adopted just before I turned 1 year old.
Awesome. So if you see any of us looking at our phones, we're probably checking the comments on this live, and it looks like we have a couple people with us. I do know it's quite early, but we are going to be recording these and leaving these up, and we actually have the last 3 lives that we did recorded and saved on our YouTube. So if you want to check those out, we highly recommend that. But let's just jump right in. So I think for some of us, we talked about really wanting to just address this topic of being pro or anti-adoption. This is a question that, I started getting, and I think many of us on this call started getting as soon as we started talking about adoption and talking about, our opinions and our experiences about adoption. I started getting questions like, are you against adoption? What does this mean? Are you for adoption or pro-adoption, anti-adoption? Do you think adoption should be banned? What is adoption reform? All of these questions started kind of getting thrown at me. And some of them I wasn't really expecting or didn't know how to answer. And I think I had to kind of like sit with them for a little bit and craft like my sort of what felt like PR statement whenever I got these questions from either family or friends or strangers. And that's kind of what we wanted to talk about today, because there definitely is sort of some, what I like to say is, I feel like adoptee stories are often pinned against each other. So we have like positive adoptee stories and negative adoptee stories. That's how a lot of people like to kind of clump us into groups and then use our stories against each other and sort of pin us against each other. Or sometimes there's some division in the adoptee community, disagreements and arguments about what should be happening in adoption or adoption reform or adoption abolition. So I wanted to talk about those things this group right here is our behind the scenes team at Rewriting Adoption. And we have talked about these things in our team meetings often. And, we always kind of go around and share our opinions. We're very respectful of each other. And so you'll see that here today. But yeah, I think there's definitely room for us to all have different opinions on this topic. And I would love for all of us to just kind of share, what you're thinking or how you're feeling about it. I think one thing I do want to caveat is that my feelings about adoption change pretty much daily, maybe even hourly sometimes, depending on the day. So I really encourage anyone who's not an adoptee to just be really respectful of adoptees when you're talking about adoption to them, and know that whatever we're saying is based off of our lived experience. And really all you need to do is listen and validate us. You do not need to ask us these questions, but we wanted to address them today. We wanted to talk about, maybe some of our grievances with these questions, or some of our answers if we're comfortable sharing. But yeah, I want to just kind of open it up to anyone who wants to kind of jump in and talk about, how they feel about sort of this like pro anti-adoption, and what they feel like it does to our community. Does anyone want to kick us off?
I can. I've never, well, I can't say never. Seldom have I ever heard anti-adoption, which isn't great. I've always heard it being like a very positive and like everyone should adopt if you can or if you want to. And I think that, we obviously know that over harping of just like do it is just toxic and not always great. I personally think that if an adoption is to happen, it should start first within the biological family. Anybody who can adopt within the family or is willing to adopt should have first say, I guess. That sounds horrible to say, to try to keep the baby within the biological family if at all possible. So yeah, that's my opening thought.
Thanks, Isaiah.
I think a lot of people would be, a lot more people would be anti-adoption if they realized what actually took place. If they realized that birth mothers are often coerced, that adoption agencies, first of all, is a multi-billion-dollar industry that targets impoverished communities, and literally, like, they lie to them. Like, no one said to my birth mother or any of our birth mothers, like, if you relinquish your child, they're going to be at greater risk for all of these horrible things. No one told them that. They told them that they were going to be doing this wonderful thing for another couple, which is another reason why I'm anti-adoption, because it's completely not child-centered. I don't understand how give the child a loving home became so intertwined with erase the child's history, change the child's identity, falsify their birth certificate, which is another funny thing, because a lot of people think that closed adoptions happen because birth parents want anonymity, which is actually far less statistically common that they want anonymity. Those laws were actually put into place. I believe California was one of the first states to close records, and it was because celebrities who had adopted were being blackmailed because being infertile brought so much societal shame that they actually started closing records and putting adoptive parents on the birth certificate, so it would be easier to conceal from the child and from the world that the child is adopted in the first place. So that's also adoptive parent centered. So yeah, just that tidbit. I'm going to stop now. If anybody wants to take it away, I'll keep going forever.
No, I love everything you just shared, because I think it's really an important piece that when we get these questions, are you pro-adoption, or are you anti-adoption, or how can you be against adoption, or why are you against adoption? It is very telling that that person just hasn't done a lot of digging or research into the adoption industry or adoption practices or adoption trauma, I think that's the part that is hard for me, is like I've done a lot of my own research, and not because I wanted to, because I'm an adoptee and these things started happening to me where I started feeling like I had some mental health issues that I needed support with, or I wanted to find other adoptees. And I was wondering, am I alone in this? And it really led me down these rabbit holes of learning more about the adoption industry and learning about some of the practices and the coercion that happens with birth mothers. And I think that that is very different from the dominant narrative that we hear about adoption. So I'm so glad you brought all of those points up, Kristen, because I think you're right. I think it's very telling when somebody asks these questions that you just haven't, you must not have like learned about adoption yet. You must not know about all of these things that some of us have had to learn or taken the time to learn. But my thing is like, then it's not my job really to educate you. I think there are some adoptees that are, they have services to do that or they're willing to do that. And that's great. But I think also for some of us, it's like emotional labor that we shouldn't have to go through. And so all I think you need to say is like, I just think you need to learn more about adoption, and here are some places you can go learn. But I'm just glad that it's becoming a little bit more of a national conversation. I think we've seen that now with the abortion conversation and adoption overlapping, which we feel like they should be separate conversations. But I'm hoping that more people just start getting curious about realizing that they don't know a lot about adoption. They don't know a lot about adoption trauma, or they don't know a lot about the adoption industry. So hopefully they continue to learn about it. But thank you so much, Kristen, for bringing those things up. And I think they're really important to think about.
Yeah.
Also, one thing, oh, go ahead. I'm sorry. I don't
Go
want to
ahead.
cut you. I was just going to say one thing that that you said that really speaks to me was like, I wonder how many birth mothers would be okay knowing, with that different framing of like, having a better life versus like your child is going to go through a ton of trauma. Is going to be going through hardship throughout the rest of their lives. Like, had they known and been educated about all of those things that we go through, I wonder, how things might be different. And I think that's so much of what we need of this narrative change and this reframing essentially of what is adoption, and like just the societal change of preservation of family as opposed to adoption. Like, why are we not having that our top priority? Again, speaking to like what Isaiah said, it should be, in my opinion, if the birth family is not able to provide a stable home for that family, and then like go a little further out, but still try to keep it within the family as much as you can. And then maybe we just go into guardianship if that's not able to be achieved. But it should always be the priority to keep the child in connection with their family as much as possible. And I just wish that as a whole in society, we could really start to reframe the narrative of what really is adoption.
Yeah. And I think like exactly that point, family separation versus family preservation. Adoption isn't seen as family separation, but that's literally what it is. But it's not, it hasn't been painted as that picture. So when we're talking pro or anti-adoption, really we're talking about family separation or family preservation. And it's like, shouldn't everyone be on board for family preservation? I'm curious, and I have an answer to this as well, but I'm curious if anyone wants to share. Did your opinions change over time once you started learning more about adoption, or were you always anti-adoption, or were you always pro-adoption? Have you changed your opinions over time? Was it like learning about adoption that is what changed it? Like what sort of changed your mind as you dug a little deeper into what the adoption industry is about? Does anyone want to share?
I I can share. If my internet cuts out, I apologize. DJ. I have a complicated relationship with adoption in general, being adoptee, is something, I came out of the fog when I was in my early 20s, but adoption has always been a part of my life and something that I, as an individual, have been running away from. My family and I guess my parents have tried to adopt other children. And I was pro-adoption for a very long time because the children that came in and out of our lives, their parents it was a cycle of trauma. I'm not going to share their stories because that's not right. But it formed my parents' opinion that family separation, which is not what they would call it, was needed. And like for the children's safety. And I had a very hard time understanding growing up how parents could do horrible things to their biological children. And as I grew up, I realized there were layers to me. I was told by family members, by friends, I am an adopted person, and they never wanted to meet their biological parents. Or like they never wondered. And I would always think to myself, what's wrong with me? Like, why do I feel so different than these other adopted kids, these other adopted adults in my family? I know that, like, I'm just going to call it out. Adoption is very prevalent in different religions, because it's seen as saving, like literally a God complex, white saviorism. My parents would never admit to that, but they did play a role in it. And there's laws that came out the year I was adopted, saying that adoptee centers need to provide multicultural information to adoptee families to combat the erasure of cultures. But if people don't know about that, I didn't know about that until I was in graduate school, learning about social welfare policies. People don't know, and people don't ask if they don't care. And the only reason people would care, I've found, is if it affects them, and if there's it's so black and white, and it's not. We all have our experiences and stories as adoptees, and it makes me so angry when people try to put us in boxes. I've tried to put myself in a box, and realizing that I'm more than just what I need to check off on, like doctor visits or census or applying for college or anything where I have to put like my ethnicity or, do you know how painful it is to put down at just what's your medical history, and not knowing because of this thing that happened as a child, and having a mental health person say why are you getting upset? We're not even to the actual questions yet. And I'm sobbing, and I don't have an answer on whether I'm pro or anti. I just think that change needs to happen. And I have hope that change is going to happen. We as adoptees are a family in and of itself, and families can have conflict, can have differing opinions. That's okay. But there needs to be a level of respect to hear and listen and respect people's experiences and support them unconditionally.
Yes. Oh my gosh. Thank you so much, DJ. You touched on a lot of things. Yeah, a lot of things. And I think that that's one thing that just kind of stuck out to me that you were saying is a lot of us take our own experience, we take our own lens because that's all we know. And so we're applying things that happen to us, erasure. I mean, I can't count, 3, 4, 5. There's 5 transracial adoptees on this call. And so we have a lot of, additional loss that we experienced, a loss of our culture, for some of us, loss of our language, for some of us, loss of our country. So there's just so much that we're thinking about when people are asking us these questions. Why are you against adoption? Why are you for adoption? Or, and we're all bringing our personal experience to those answers. I think for me, I have heard a lot of adoptees who want to talk really positively about adoption. And I think many years ago, I could have fallen into that bucket because, for one reason, my sister, who's here on this call, was someone who was very important to me. So I thought that adoption meant family. I thought that, like, growing up, I thought I had to sort of protect my family and be loyal to this family. But I was completely ignoring my roots and my biological family because it was like a survival mode for me. But I think that that's something that we all have to think about, is a lot of us are bringing our personal experiences, our personal relationships into these conversations. And it causes, obviously, like, we're going to get defensive about our opinions if we're talking about family members or people that are important to us. But for me, I've started separating those things. There's a difference between family and adoption. When I think about my relationship with my sister, that's just because she's my sister. That's not really anything to do with the adoption industry or the adoption institution. I mean, like, we came together because of those things. So I think talking about that is important, and talking against what I personally view as very unethical. I'm very much against transracial adoption. I'm very much against international adoption. And it took me a really long time to be comfortable to say that. But now I know enough about how it's just not protecting the child. It's not child-centered. I can't be for it. Like, I absolutely just can't. But that doesn't really take away from my relationship with my sister. And I think that that's where some of us kind of get stuck or get really defensive. But I want to make sure that we all have a chance to talk, and if we disagree or agree with each other, we all are able to share that. So, Martha, do you have anything you want to add to this pro or anti, or have you been asked that question before, and sort of what is your response?
I have not actually been asked that before. I think people just assume I'm pro-adoption. And I know in the past, I definitely was pro-adoption. Like, I would just feel like everyone should just adopt instead of have their children biologically. Like, I was like, totally, so much has changed since then. Now, of course, I understand it's not child-centered anymore, like I thought it was. And, I educated myself since then. Now, just like DJ says, it's not black and white. It really is complicated. And I really just look at it case by case. I don't really think it's right to make a blanket statement, because in my situation, my adoptive parents didn't get me directly from my birth parents. My birth parents did not relinquish me. My birth parents, there was a lot of addiction and mental illness and undocumented status in this country. There's a lot of factors at play, and my birth parents weren't able to take care of me. I mean, they tried, but Child Protective Services stepped in. They tried to offer resources and they didn't accept it. Then my birth family, I had an aunt and uncle and cousins that would have partial custody of me. So I spent time with them in the foster home. They decided that this wasn't for them. They didn't really want it. So I can't exactly hold that against the social workers, because they really did try. They gave them resources, my birth parents, and they tried to help my extended birth family. And at the end of the day, they just decided that they just didn't want to take that on, that responsibility. They felt like that wasn't theirs. So I had no one else. The rest of my birth family was in Mexico. And to be fair, it wouldn't have been child-centered to deport me with them, because I was born in America. And, they lived in a really violent, dangerous area in Mexico. So it wouldn't have been right to send me back with them. So there really was no other option. I was in foster care. And for me, I'd rather have been adopted like I was than to spend the rest of my life going home to home and then aging out. So I think for me, it's not so simple being like, oh, all adoption should never happen, because there really are children that are in need and would like a permanent home and would like to have someone that they feel like they could say that they have a mom and dad. But I definitely believe in reform. So my vocabulary is more about reform. I like the idea of like legal guardianship, and that way we don't have this erasure. That way I could have had contact with my birth siblings. I could have at least been able to know about them growing up. So that, I feel like there's so much that has to change for sure. But yeah, I guess my vocabulary is not like anti-adoption, because I think people hear that and they think, oh, no, you don't want any child to have like a home or, their own people. I feel like that's not necessarily what it means. I feel like people hear that and they shut down. So I'm just more about like adoption reform, and changing what adoption means, so that adoption in the future doesn't mean exactly what it means now. But yeah, I agree. It's not child-centered right now, and I think it should be. So that's where I stand.
I love it, Martha. I love everything you just touched on. I'm so glad you brought up legal guardianship. And also, just for context here, Martha and Isaiah and DJ, were you foster care as well? Are you a foster care youth?
I was not.
Okay, so just Martha.
Technically, but I was always with my parents.
Okay, gotcha. But yeah, so we have domestic adoption on this call. We have international adoption on this call. We also have foster care with Martha here. So I'm so glad that we have all these different perspectives, because I think it's a really important point, Martha, that you bring up, that a lot of times we'll throw blanket statements on, whether it should or shouldn't be, whether adoption should or shouldn't be. And that's exactly what we're trying to like change, is that we don't want blanket statements anymore. We don't want a one size fits all narrative, because all of our stories are different. We're all individual humans that have individual stories. So I'm so glad you brought that up. And I'm also so glad you brought up legal guardianship. And I'd love to hear others' thoughts on that, as well as adoption reform. I think that was something when I started learning about just adoption practices and like what is out there for adoption reform, who's working on this, what does that mean, like what needs to change, how can we change it? And legal guardianship is something that it took a while for me to understand and learn about, like how that works and why that's such a great alternative to adoption. But for anyone who needs a little bit of background or context, we all basically were adopted without our consent. So there's no consent on the adoptee's part in adoption. Biological parents and adoptive parents go into that agreement and sign all these adoption papers. And the adoptee, I mean, usually because they're thought of as, they're too young, but we didn't consent to our adoption. That's something that really, for me personally, that's something that bothers me to this day. It's really hard for me to kind of get over that. And so what legal guardianship would do is it would be the biological parent and the legal guardian would go into an agreement that they become the child's legal guardian. And then it would be up to the child to decide if and when they wanted to be adopted by their legal guardian. So they would be able to consent to that adoption, and it would be like, and then we wouldn't have some of the erasure of birth certificates and documents being sealed. So there's a lot of that conversation happening in the adoptee community, and we're trying to get it out into the public so people understand this more. But I would love to hear anyone else's thoughts, maybe like how you first started learning about it or where you stand now on it, or just anything if you want to share any thoughts about legal guardianship, or like personally, like I just shared, what that would have meant for you, or how you feel about that.
There's a lot of there's, an adoption is the end of any, first of all, you have the erasure, obviously, but there are, like, with legal guardianship, kids, like these kids in this situation would have certain like assistances, and there would be like more oversight. There's like therapy and just like different, I'm trying to think of they would have access to more support with legal guardianship, whereas like when I think about my private closed domestic adoption, it was just like there was no social service checkups. It was just, check was sent in, everything was signed, and then no one ever checked up on me. And that's not the case with legal guardianship. I don't like, obviously there are cases where reunification is not safe, or like it's not possible, but I don't believe, I don't know what I'm trying to say. Like, I don't know what I'm trying to say. I'm sorry.
No, you're fine. You're fine. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, I just think that it's like, it just doesn't make any sense to me how, all these, like, how there's so many like liberal feminists who are accepting of the fact that, like, kind of as adoption as it stands, it's kind of, since a lot of the reason why people relinquish their children is because of poverty, it's almost like they're okay, like people are okay with the fact that adoption, as a solution to poverty is like adopting, poor people's children to the rich. And I think a lot of people who have been thinking that and calling that beautiful have, some rethinking to do and some answering to do about that. So that was pretty much it.
I agree with that so much. And I think we have to also think about, for all of us, we all were adopted to or were born in the States. And the United States is like one of the highest has the highest numbers of international adoptions compared to other states or compared to other countries. And so just thinking about some of those like systemic issues that are in our country, just some of the things that our country was built on, some of the racism, or I shouldn't say some of, all of the racism in this country. I mean, everything that our society was built on is but mostly built on white supremacy. So when you think about how people view adoption in this country, they're going to think that white affluent parents are better parents than any brown or black or indigenous parents who are in poverty. And this is like we're all wrapped up into it. So this is exactly what we're trying to talk about. We're trying to change these things and talk about, like, it's not just like, let's reform and let's change and let's protect and let's focus this more on the child, but like, let's also talk a little bit about like what adoption has become, and especially in this country, and why are we not talking about that? Why are adoptees the only ones that seem to be talking about that? And then when we do try to talk about it, we seem to be silenced a lot, or, people just want us to go away. Especially if we talk negatively or we talk anything against adoption, it's always just like, oh, you just had a bad experience, and that's why you're talking so negatively about this. This is a beautiful thing. So that's something that just really bothers me, because it's like, if you look at any other institution in this country, you can see the issues with it, and adoption very much falls into the same categories as others. So does anyone else have any other thoughts on anything I just shared, or legal guardianship, like what that would mean for them, or if you would view it differently? I'd love to hear.
I just saw my original birth certificate, within the last 6 months, and I didn't even really know that my biological parents were taken off and that my adoptive parents' names were replaced on. And when I saw that, I was really, 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 really disappointed. I was like, what? What is going on? Like, obviously I knew what was going on, but like, it was really disappointing and like kind of heartbreaking. I was like, that is like literally not possible for these two people to have created me. So it's just like, it's just not right. I mean, like when you look at your birth certificate, you're supposed to see a reflection of who you are. And when I look at mine, I see an altered piece of manufactured whiteness that allowed them, that they were able to buy and embrace a name and put their own names on it. And now, you know, even the other day, my sister reminded me, she was like, well, technically, you know, and speaking of my adoptive parents, she said, technically, those are your parents. And I was like, well, I mean, that's what the paper says, but like, realistically, like, they cannot do it. And I just don't think that's very, like, adoptee centered at all, because it creates a lot of chaos, either consciously now as adults or even just subconsciously as a kid. You know, your identity is being changed and it's not at all being adoptee center. And then yeah, when adoptees later grow up and they start questioning or start having issues, you know, it's like, then we want them to, like, you know, figure it out and be okay. And it's just like, you know, there should be services along the way. I think Kristen was mentioning that, or maybe it was you, Rachel. Services along the way to help the adoptee out. And just in general, you know, if like the adoptee can't consent to their adoption, there should definitely be support and things set up on the background. So as the kid ages, you know, they're still being assisted throughout the entire process. And so, yeah, that's just kind of my initial thoughts that I've kind of had over the last few months since I've seen my original. I was also really disappointing because I had to tell my biological dad's side, like his name was never on my original. He just was playing games and didn't want to sign it until it was too late. And then he was like, wait, I want my name on it. And so he's lived, and I don't mean to spell his business, but I mean, like, the sad reality is he's like lived a long time thinking my name's not on it. I would just like it to be on it. And it's like, bro, your name was never going to be on it. Like, it hasn't been on it since I was adopted, you know, and so it's really unfortunate that he wasn't even notified that, you know, of the change. And so anyways, that's just some.
Yeah, and that, like those services, like legal guardianship, first of all, I think it would weed out a lot of people who want to adopt children for selfish reasons. It would like legal guardianship, it makes it so much easier. It makes it so much harder for like everyone around the child to just ignore the fact that this child is in this innate situation where they have been taken away from their family for whatever reason, that they have experienced massive amounts of loss. Like, and with, you know, with adoption as it is, like, most of us were raised as if it never happened, and legal guardianship just wouldn't allow that. It would take care of some of the gaslighting and the basically feeling crazy, like, oh, that never happened and now I'm supposed to be well adjusted. Like, yeah.
And I think that's a great point. Like, and I would love for someone else to talk about this if you want to, but with legal guardianship, weeding out those potential adoptive parents or legal guardians, you know, right now, when we say adoption isn't child-centered, it's adoptive parent-centered. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about it's attracting these people that just want a child, or it's being used as an infertility solution, which we all agree is not child-centered.
Family building tool.
Yeah. So would anyone want to talk about that? Just kind of what we're talking about, because we've used those words a lot, child-centered, and like weeding out adoptive parents that are just like in this for themselves or thinking about themselves or using it for infertility. Does anyone want to talk about how we would like to change that as part of the narrative?
I think Go, DJ, go.
No, oh no, you go, Sarah. It's okay.
It's okay. You first.
Okay. Well, my headspace is still trying to wrap my head around legal guardianship, but I just want to share, and this comes from a place of anger, and I think that, and that's okay, that it comes from a place of anger. I was thinking before this call about how my adoption has never been a secret, but no one ever sat me down and talked about it. I had to piece together things on my own. As I grew up, I was given more information. I literally was told as a child a fairy tale version of how I came to be with my family. And as I grew up is when my parents were advised by resources, by the adoption center, like, but it was a private adoption, so like a lawyer, an adoptee lawyer, about how not to put everything on me, like not to tell like the darker side. So as I learned about the darker side, the more I was like, oh, like there was anger. And I think about how there are dark sides to adoption. There's dark sides to just any regular family, any nuclear family, like biological family is what I mean when I say nuclear. There's trauma, and our society is not okay with having difficult conversations, even when it comes to any loss. We're expected to rebound really quickly from breakups, from losing a family member, losing a friend. Oh, you're still upset over that? We're not given patience, the room to, we in society are expected to, quote unquote, pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. We're expected to heal ourselves. But I mean, learning the history, and I learned some of the history, and it was like, I wasn't even looking for these informations. Like the first child welfare laws to protect children came off of the format of protecting livestock. So, and I've noticed that there are a lot more resources on how to take care of animals, of dogs who are rescued, who are adopted. There's more resources, free resources, and that are connected to like adoptee or foster dog parents, like behavior and how to help the dog adjust. There's a lack of there, like the adoption and social services are more concerned with being able to place a child somewhere safe, but they don't check up, and these children are more at risk of being abused by their foster families, their adoptee families. And I'm angry because I think to myself, well, what can I do? But I'm just one person. I can't save everyone. And it's frustrating that I'm trying to think of how I can help. And it tends to be the people that are hurt the most that are like, let me help. And it's not like, we have to do the double of growing ourselves, making sure that we're healthy enough to help others, educate our caregivers on why we're struggling, when they're not only are they not giving the resources, but they're under the impression that they did the good thing. Now, like, let's like you need to open up to us. Like, no, you adoptees need more transparency because we have trust issues, and how can, like, that's like a developmental part of a person. The first thing is that you need to be able to trust, and we're already set up to kind of like fail if we don't have that trust, whether or not we're adopted as babies, or if we were adopted, late adoptees. And it needs to change. And I'm gonna end it there.
Yeah, it's a hard way to live. Like, it's like it's like when you're lied to about your, like, when things are just not, clear, or not like clarified for you, or you're like flat out lied to, like, like, fine. The moment that I realized that, it's like my biological, or excuse me, my adoptive mom had contact with my biological family, allowed them to come to my gymnastics practices. You guys all know this. The moment that I realized all of that, and also that every single time that I went to the doctor as a child, I wrote down no medical history. People are telling me that she lied to me to protect me, but every single time that we went to the doctor, I wrote down no medical history accessible. No medical history accessible. And that's a really odd way to protect a child, because, I feel like it just would have been better for all of us if our doctors, like our primary care physicians, had just had access to our medical history all along, just would have been better.
And I think about that too with the whole legal guardianship. I'm like, what if in the future, and this is very futuristic talking, but what if they can look at your birth certificate, see who your birth parents are, use that DNA and use their medical history to help the current patient? I'm like, so what happens now if that is something that is possible, or something even like that? They look at it and they see two people who aren't even of my race, looking at their medical history and being like, here's what we have to offer you. And it would be like, okay, I don't want anything that you would give them. Like, we're not, like, that's not compatible at all. And so that's just something that I'm thinking about, like, as technology advances, like, who knows where that leaves people whose birth certificates have been literally altered to not reflect anything that's true.
Yeah. It makes you feel like a ghost.
A little.
Yeah. I've often felt like I'm trying to find it right now. I saw this great tweet the other day from an adoptee, and I was like, oh my gosh, that's exactly how I've always felt. You know how when you have to do the family tree project in school, and I don't know if any of you had to do that, but I remember being just so like confused. Like, why am I adding all these people from my adoptive family? I don't even know. Like, it's not connecting for me. And I've always said to like my family, my very, very close family and friends, that I just have always felt like a branch, just kind of like floating around on my own, like not really tied to anyone's tree, because, I felt like I was cut off from my biological family's tree, and I don't fit on my adoptive family's tree. It doesn't make sense. So that's how it feels. Like, it feels like such confusion and loss. And I have many times where I am struggling with identity crises, like, and I hate when people are always like, oh, I had those, or, I went through that in my 20s or my 30s. And it's like, you don't even know what this is like. Like, you can't even comprehend it. And I think that's a really big point, is that people who are able to remain in their biological families can't even comprehend this type of trauma, this level of loss, this level of grief, this level of pain and sadness. And I saw a stat recently too about foster care youth having higher rates of PTSD than veterans. And that makes sense to me. I've been diagnosed with PTSD. That makes a lot of sense to me, but it does not make a lot of sense to people who are just learning about these things, especially non-adopted people. And I've literally had people say to me, like, why do you have PTSD? I thought there had to be some sort of significant event for you to have PTSD. And it's like, yeah, the significant event was like the moment I was born, I was separated from my mother. That is something that a lot of, like we talked about, animals having more rights than humans in this situation. You don't separate an animal from its mother until it's a certain age because it's detrimental to their health. So I think we need to think about these things more, and we need to talk about them more. And like DJ saying, like, what can I do? I'm just one person. I think what we can do as people, as adoptees, is talk about these things like we're doing right now and see if there's anyone out there. Like, if there's anyone out there, and I would love to put this out there, if this somehow makes its way to any adoptee, if you're working on anything adoption reform related, like, we would love to hear from you. We would love to talk to you. We are looking for ways at Rewriting Adoption to try and get more involved with advocacy work and really define what that means, and trying to see if there's anything we can do, especially if legal guardianship is a way that we feel like is more child-centered. Then that's something that we will definitely look into seeing how we can support it. What can we do to move that forward more? But I want to also, just like, before we wrap up, open it up to the floor, because something we've talked about, and Sarah or Martha, since you haven't talked in a little bit, maybe one of you can talk about this, but we've talked about it as a group. How do we remain a safe space for adoptees? And like, how do we remain a safe and inclusive space for adoptees who are on varying degrees of these opinions about adoption reform, adoption abolition, or even pro-adoption? I think we've seen that, people saying, I want more positive stories. I don't want all these negative stories. That's something we've struggled with. And how can we really, how can we try to remain a safe space, but also do what we came here to do, which is to change the dominant adoption narrative and to change the narrative to be child-centered and not be adoptive parent-centered. And I know that that's a huge question, so maybe you can't really answer it, but like, do you have any thoughts on that, on how to keep these spaces safe for adoptees?
Just like before answering that,
Yeah.
one thing I just wanted to add to like this whole reform thing is the science. Like, let's get some published science out there. We deserve to have it out there. We deserve to have adoption in the DSM, and we deserve to have the right to have easy access to therapy and all these things. Like, I would love to try and see if there really truly is, which I believe there is, a correlation between narcissistic abuse and adoption. I think like there's just so many things that it would just be so nice to have that. I know the science is there. It would just be so nice to have it have it back up our claims and not be like this thing that we have to debate on. Do we have trauma? Do we not have a trauma? Adoption is trauma. Like, let's get it in writing if this is what the world needs to see, because we deserve to just like have it undebatably so, So that's just one thing I just want to add about that. But to answer your other question of how can we, continue to make this space a safe space for people, I think it's just reiterating that everybody's adoption experience is their own experience, and everyone is on their own trajectory of life, and they may view things differently than you. But I think I think we have a common goal. If we do want to see change, we do want to see reform. And so maybe like when we have different opinions, at least that can kind of be like our North Star of like what we're really trying to accomplish. That's what I would say. How about you, Martha?
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. I mean, exactly. I think at the end of the day, we have the same goal, and it's really that any other displaced children, we want them to have the least fucked up experience possible. We want to make it easier than we
Yes.
had it. That's, I think, everything, like we all exclusively want that experience. And I think people that think they have this like perfect fairy tale adoption, I think that they're probably in denial about other dark parts. As DJ said, there's dark parts in every adoption, whether we want to acknowledge it or not. And maybe you haven't seen it or you haven't felt it, but it's there somewhere and you can't act like it doesn't exist. So I feel like we have to acknowledge that even if you had the most ideal adoption possible, there is still some negative there too. So we have to address it and we can make it better. So that's what I say. And I agree with the whole transparency. Like that's another great thing with the guardianship. Like why would you not want transparency? Like I don't understand how anyone would be against transparency. And the, Kristen brought up like the health thing, which is a really big thing. Like I didn't know my mother had like schizophrenia or whatever she has. So it's like growing up, maybe that would have been nice for my primary care providers to know to look for that or to screen certain things if like breast cancer runs in my family or anything like that. Like that is literally our livelihood. So we should have access to that and we shouldn't hide it just to make the adoptive parents feel better about themselves. So yeah, that's what I have to say.
Oh, I love it. I love everything Sarah and Martha just shared. So important. So I'm so glad we got those things in at the very end because, yeah, for sure, we need more research. We need more support. And not because we need the validation. Like Sarah said, we know these things. We know these things to be true. I don't need to see it in a report to believe it. I know it. I know it's there, but it would at least give us the leverage to start advocating for things like ACEs, like adverse child experiences, and like for insurance and for mental health issues. Like all of these things would really help in those situations. And then I'm just so glad that we all spoke to about all the different things that affect us and all the different ways that adoption and trauma has been affecting our lives. Because I think that that's what's getting missed when these questions are coming up, when these questions of like, why are you against adoption? Why are you anti, are you pro adoption? And it's really simple when you start looking into it. So instead of asking those questions, I really urge people to just look into adoption trauma and the adoption industry. And what we're trying to do here at Rewriting Adoption is to try to change the narrative to be one that's less focused on adoptive parents and more focused on adoptees, one that's less of a blanket, one size fits all fairy tale narrative, and one that's more true and honest and real and raw. This is life. This isn't just some special thing that happened to us. This is something that was really traumatic. And whether we experience that trauma throughout our lives in various ways, that's just what happens to us individually as people. So if you're an adoptee and you're watching this and you feel like you've had a really positive experience, you have a really great relationship with your adoptive parents, that's amazing. And we would love to talk about that. We would love to tell that story. I would also really urge those adoptive parents, if they're out there, if there are healthy adoptive parents out there, I would really urge them to get involved in talking about adoption trauma, talking about the adoption industry, talking about their role in this adoption institution as a whole. And what can we do to advocate for adoptee rights? What can we do to advocate for centering children in the situation? It's not happening right now. It needs to happen. It needs to change. And that's something that we're all working towards. And we would love additional help in doing so. I think, we would never turn anyone away to help us on this mission. I think it's a really important mission to us. And we're looking to get as much traction as we can. So I'm just so grateful to all of you, like absolutely adore all of you. And thank you so much for sharing your stories and for being vulnerable. This series has been some of the most important topics to us, but we'd love to hear from other adoptees what topics are important to you. We're going to start opening these up. So we're actually going to be switching from this format to adoptee forums, where we're going to invite other adoptees to join us in these conversations, so we can talk with more adoptees. That's one of our things too. I think if you have a very specific lens on adoption, I really urge you to listen to other adoptee stories, because that was, for me, that was sort of the biggest eye-opening thing, was I just started listening to other stories and realizing my story was very different, but there's also a lot of crossover. So that's a great way to start just getting a better understanding of adoption. And the last thing I want to mention, just for anyone who's looking for support, we started Rewriting Adoption, Sarah and I, my sister here, we started it because we were really struggling. Like at one point, both of us were really struggling and we needed to lean on each other. We had had a very tough relationship growing up, and it had caused a lot of friction in our relationship. We've talked about that and how adoption trauma, sort of led to that. But we really needed a buddy in that moment when we were sort of processing our adoptions, coming out of the fog, learning about the industry, learning about adoption ethics and lack thereof. So that was sort of the beginning of Rewriting Adoption, of realizing that when you go through these things, whether you're friends or not, whether you're enemies or not, Sarah and I have talked about how we were frenemies for a really long time. We grew up in the same house. We had very similar stories, but we still had a lot of differences and a lot of different experiences. And we needed support in that moment. And we were there for each other. And so I really hope that the adoptee community can always stick together and always remember that we're here for you. If you need support, if you need anyone to talk to, everyone on this call I know is open to that. So please reach out to us if you are looking for that. And we hope you can join us for future events. We're going to sign off now, though. This is our last live, and thank you so much for joining us. We'll be back for more for sure.
You guys.
Bye.
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 Bye.